Former Oregon Senator Bob Packwood has died at the age of 93. Packwood served in the U.S. Senate for more than 25 years. He was known as a moderate Republican who often broke with his party. He championed abortion rights, family leave, gun control, environmental causes, and protections against discrimination. He was also the first Republican senator to publicly support impeachment proceedings against President Richard Nixon. But his career ended in 1995 after more than 20 women accused him of unwanted sexual advances. A Senate Ethics Committee recommended he be expelled, and Packwood resigned before a full Senate vote. The Portland native was elected to the Senate in 1968 at age 36 and was once the chamber's youngest member. Packwood died today at a care facility in California. His wife, Elaine Franklin, confirmed his death. And Oregon's Dorchester Conference is remembering former Senator Packwood. Packwood founded the group in 1965. It is considered Oregon's oldest continuous political gathering and the largest grassroots Republican conference in the state. In a statement, the group said Packwood started the conference to bring Oregonians together to talk about ideas and public policy, saying in the statement, quote, "For more than 6 decades, that vision has helped shape generations of civic and political leaders across Oregon. Today, we remember his commitment to public service, his belief in the importance of civic engagement, and the enduring institution he created."